The rain began as a soft mist against the towering stained glass windows of the grand estate, where every corner had been transformed into a spectacle for what society had dubbed the wedding of the year. And yet for Alina, it felt like the slow tightening of a noose. She stood in the dressing chamber surrounded by layers of white silk lace and pearls, the weight of the gown pressing against her ribs as if it knew it was not meant for her. She could hear the muffled hum of voices from the guests below, the rustle of expensive fabrics, the metallic clink of champagne flutes, and somewhere in the distance, the slow melodic swell of the string quartet rehearsing the processional she was supposed to walk to. Her mother's voice floated in from the hallway, crisp and commanding, reminding her of the importance of tonight, how their family's standing depended on it, how Victor was the most suitable match they could have hoped for. Alina kept her eyes on her reflection, unable to recognize the girl staring back, the painted lips, the powdered cheeks, the heavy crown of jewels on her head. They had stripped her of every piece of herself until only a porcelain doll remained. Victor was a man with money and influence, but no warmth. His smile never reached his eyes, and when he spoke to her, it was with the same detached tone he might use to order wine at a restaurant. He was nearly twice her age and had a reputation for cruelty that no one dared to confront but to her family. This was a necessary transaction. She had been raised for moments like this, raised to marry well, to secure alliances and maintain appearances, yet every beat of her heart screamed against it. The thought of binding herself to that man felt like stepping into a cage she would never escape, and so the plan she had formed in secret over the past week burned like a live coal inside her. The motorcycle was hidden in the shadows behind the servants' quarters, an old battered machine she had worked on herself during stolen hours at a mechanic shop across town, where no one from her world would dare to look. Her fingers itched to grip the handlebars, her lungs desperate for air not perfumed with obligation. She waited until the bustle in the hallway grew loud enough to cover her movement, then slipped out the side door. The cold evening air hit her like a slap rain, beginning to bead on her skin as she lifted the skirts of her gown and hurried barefoot through the grass. The motorcycle loomed like salvation in the dim light, her hands shaking as she threw one leg over the seat and twisted the key. The engine coughed, then roared to life, the sound loud enough to draw shouts from the guards posted near the gates. Their voices carried over the rain as they ran toward her, but she was already pulling away the long driveway, a slick ribbon under her wheels. She leaned forward, the wind clawing at her veil and hair, the heavy skirts tangling around her legs, but she didn't slow, not when the gates grew closer, not when she saw one of the guards motion for the driver to block the exit. She swerved hard onto the side path, the motorcycle jolting over uneven gravel, and burst out onto the main road, leaving the mansion's golden lights shrinking behind her. The city unfolded ahead, its neon signs and wet streets gleaming like a promise she wove through traffic. Her heart a wild drum in her chest. The rain fell harder each second, her hair plastered to her face, her fingers numb around the grips, and yet she felt more alive than she had in years. She thought of her father, who had once told her that freedom always came at a cost, and she decided she would pay it, whatever it was. She was so consumed by the pounding in her chest that she did not see the black luxury car until it was too late. It appeared from a side street, sleek and powerful, its headlights slicing through the curtain of rain. She yanked the handlebars in a desperate swerve, but the road was slick, the motorcycle skidding sideways as the car braked with controlled precision. The impact was a hard jolt, enough to rattle her teeth, but not send her flying. She steadied the bike and looked up, ready to curse the driver when the car eased to a stop. Directly in her path, the door opened slowly, and a tall man stepped out, his movements deliberate, unhurried, as though even the rain dared not rush him. His suit was immaculate despite the weather, his dark hair slicked back, his gaze sharp and unreadable. She recognized him at once, Adrian Cale, the man the tabloids called the Ice King, a self-made billionaire whose empire stretched across industries, his reputation for ruthless efficiency matched only by his distaste for the shallow, glittering daughters of the elite. No one could name a woman who had held his interest for more than a polite conversation. His wealth was earned, not inherited, and he seemed to hold nothing but contempt for those who coasted on family fortunes. He walked toward her. Each step measured his eyes, scanning the drenched silk gown, the mud-streaked hem, the defiant tilt of her chin. When he spoke, his voice was low, steady, the kind of tone that left no room for argument. asking if she had a death wish. She tightened her grip on the handlebars, meeting his gaze without flinching, and told him she had somewhere to be and no time for lectures. He glanced at the motorcycle, then at her bare ring finger where the enormous diamond her fiancés had given her should have been. "So you're running?" he said it, not as a question, but a truth. She didn't confirm it, instead tried to maneuver around him, but his hand shot out, gripping the handlebars effortlessly, stopping her. He leaned in just enough for his voice to be heard over the rain. "You will get yourself killed riding like this." His words were not kind, but they were not entirely unfeeling either. She shot back that she would rather die on the road than live in the world she had just left. Something flickered in his expression, a shadow of recognition, before he stepped back, releasing the bike and tilting his head toward his car. "If you want to get out of the city without being dragged back," he said, "follow me, or stay here and wait for them to find you." She hesitated, every instinct wary of him, yet the sound of distant sirens made the choice for her. She followed him into the car, the leather interior warm, the faint scent of cedar and rain mingling in the air. He drove without speaking, his eyes fixed on the road, his hands steady on the wheel. She sat with her arms folded against herself, feeling his occasional glance as if he were piecing together a puzzle. Finally he asked who she was running from. She said, "My future," and the corner of his mouth lifted almost imperceptibly. He told her he had no interest in saving people, especially not spoiled rich girls made bad choices. She bristled at that and told him she wasn't rich, not in the way he thought her family's money had never been hers. It was a leash, one she had been straining against for years. She told him about the mechanic's shop, how she had hidden her work there from her family, how she had fixed that very motorcycle with her own hands for the first time. His expression shifted just slightly, as if she had surprised him. The drive carried them out of the city, the neon glow fading to the black stretch of coastal road, waves crashing unseen in the darkness. He stopped near a small cabin half hidden among wind-twisted pines, telling her she could stay there for the night and leave before sunrise. She followed him inside. The space was warm with the scent of wood smoke and salt, the furnishings simple yet inviting. He handed her a towel and went to the kitchen to make coffee. She wandered briefly, taking in the shelves lined with books, the absence of anything gilded or ornamental, when he returned with 2 steaming mugs. He sat opposite her, his gaze steady, as he asked again why she had run. This time she told him everything, from the years of being treated as a bargaining chip to the moment she realized her wedding was a business deal, to the suffocating expectations that had crushed her dreams. As she spoke, she felt something in her chest loosen, his jaw tightened at her words. Though he said nothing, she noticed his hand curl around the mug as if holding back something unspoken. When she finished, the air between them felt heavier. He told her she had 2 choices: go back to the life she hated, or decide her own fate, but warned that deciding meant living with every consequence. She met his gaze and saw not the cold, untouchable man from the headlines, but someone who understood the price of freedom. He rose and told her to rest. The storm outside, thrashing against the walls. She lay on the small bed, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts a whirl of exhaustion and adrenaline, and somewhere in the chaos, she realized with a strange certainty that their paths had not crossed by chance, and that this night was only the beginning of something that could change both their lives forever. By the time the first pale light of morning began to slip through the thin curtains of the cabin, Alina was already awake, her eyes tracing the grain of the wooden ceiling, while her thoughts drifted restlessly between the chaos she had fled and the man who had taken her in without asking for anything in return. She listened to the soft sounds of movement beyond the door, the clink of ceramic against wood and the faint hiss of a kettle, until the smell of fresh coffee curled into the air. Drawing her from the bed, she pulled the blanket around her shoulders and stepped barefoot into the small kitchen, where Adrian stood framed in the golden light of morning, his shirt sleeves rolled neatly to the elbows, his hair slightly tousled. From the damp sea air, the sight of him, so composed yet quietly powerful, made something unfamiliar stir in her chest. He looked up briefly at her entrance, his expression unreadable but not unkind, before wordlessly sliding a mug toward her across the counter. She murmured a thank you, her voice low and slightly hoarse from sleep, and wrapped her fingers around the warmth of the cup. For a few moments they drank in silence, not the strained silence of strangers, but the kind that seemed to exist. Between two people who were still learning the shape of each other's presence, he broke at first, his voice calm, but holding an edge as he asked if she had decided what she would do next, reminding her that by now her family would be calling in every favor to track her down, and that Victor would not let the humiliation of last night pass. Unanswered, she told him plainly that she had no intention of returning, but the truth was she had nowhere to go and no plan for what came next. She expected him to offer some cutting remark, but instead he regarded her in silence for a long moment before suggesting she consider leaving the country until things cooled. She shook her head, knowing Victor's influence spread far beyond borders and that she could not live the rest of her life looking over her shoulder. She needed more than just distance. She needed to build something of her own, free from the chains of her family's money and expectations. She met his gaze and asked why he was helping her. His lips curved faintly as he told her he was not helping her at all, that he simply wanted to avoid the inconvenience of seeing her crash into his car again. Yet his eyes betrayed a flicker of something else, something that made her pulse quicken. He told her there were clothes in the bedroom that might fit her, and left to take a call. She changed quickly into a soft shirt and jeans, fabric light and freeing after the suffocating silk and lace. When she emerged, he was waiting at the door, motorcycle keys in hand, telling her he was taking her somewhere safer. Outside, the sleek black bike gleamed under the rising sun, its polished frame catching the light and sending it flashing across the gravel. She hesitated before asking if she could drive. His brow arched as if testing her, but after a pause he handed her the helmet, climbing onto the seat behind her. The moment she twisted the throttle and felt the bike surge forward, the tension in her shoulders melted away. The road wound along the coastline, cliffs falling sharply to one side, while the ocean stretched out in a restless expanse. The wind tangled in her hair, and the morning air carried the mingled scents of salt water and pine. For the first time in years, she felt untethered. They stopped in a small town nestled in the curve of the coast, where cobblestone streets wound between buildings painted in warm, faded colors. Fishermen mended their nets along the docks, and the call of gulls mingled with the chatter of townsfolk. Adrian led her to a quiet and the kind of place that smelled faintly of bread and wood smoke. The owner greeted him with familiarity, and without question handed him a key. The room overlooked the harbor, and she stood at the window for a long moment, watching the sunlight sparkle across the waves. Over the next days, an unspoken rhythm settled between them. In the mornings, he would disappear into phone calls and emails while she wandered the streets speaking with locals and exploring the shops. She found work helping in a small bakery run by an elderly woman named Marta, who paid her in bread and pastries, insisting it was too little for her help. Alina found unexpected joy in it, the simple exchange of work for something tangible, the smell of rising dough, the soft powder of flour on her hands. In the evenings, Adrian returned, and they would share quiet dinners, sometimes trading stories, other times simply sitting in comfortable silence. She learned more about him piece by piece, that he had left home at 16 with nothing but the clothes on his back, that he had fought for every bit of what he owned, that the disdain he held for the elite daughters of wealthy families came from years of watching them treat people like him as playthings to be discarded when they tired of the novelty. In return, she told him about the nights she spent in the mechanic's shop, the pride she felt each time an engine roared back to life under her hands, and how it had been her only escape from a life dictated by appearances and obligation. One night, as the low hum of conversation from the dining room faded, she found herself asking why he had never married. He answered simply that love was dangerous in a world where loyalty could be bought and sold. But his gaze softened almost imperceptibly, as if something about her unsettled the certainty of his own words. Their fragile peace shattered a week later when a sleek black car appeared in the square. Two men in dark suits stepping out, scanning the street with sharp, practiced eyes. Lena's breath caught in her throat as recognition hit. They were Victor's security detail. Adrian appeared beside her, his hand firm on her arm, steering her toward the back alley without breaking stride. Once in the inn, he told her to pack. Immediately, his voice calm but laced with steel, they slipped out through the rear entrance, mounting the motorcycle and speeding away just as the men emerged from the alley. The chase that followed was a blur of roaring engines and pounding blood. Adrian's skill on the road was unmatched, weaving through narrow, winding lanes, then breaking into the open countryside with the suits in relentless pursuit. The air was sharp and cold against her face, the scent of wet earth filling her lungs as they tore down back roads that twisted through fields and forest until at last the headlights behind them vanished into the night. They did not stop until they reached a remote valley cradled between mountains, the air thinner here, the world quieter, as if they had ridden into another time. She slid off the bike, her legs unsteady from the ride, and collapsed onto a smooth rock, telling him she was tired of running and that perhaps it would be easier to go back. His eyes darkened with something that was not anger but intensity, and he stepped closer, telling her that if she gave in now, she would live, every day wondering who she might have been, had. She fought for herself that freedom was never easy, but always worth the fight. His words sank into her like heat, into cold skin, igniting a spark, she thought. She had lost. They camped there that night beneath a scatter of brilliant stars, the firelight painting gold across his features. She lay awake long after he had closed his eyes, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing and wondering why this man who had built walls higher than mountains would risk so much for her. In the morning they rode deeper into the mountains, until a lodge appeared hidden among ancient pines, the kind of place that seemed untouched by the rush of the world. It belonged to a friend of his who welcomed them without question and offered them the upper rooms. Life there moved slower days, filled with quiet tasks and unspoken companionship, but every glance, every brush of his hand against hers carried a current that neither acknowledged aloud. One evening, they sat on the porch watching the sun sink behind the peaks, the sky aflame with orange and rose, and he told her he had seen many people run from their lives, but she was the first he had seen riding toward something rather than away from it. She turned to him, her breath catching as she asked what he thought she was riding toward. He held her gaze for a long moment before saying, "Perhaps toward the person you were always meant to be," then stood and walked back inside, leaving her with the fading light. It's the cool mountain air and a heart that was no longer certain where her escape ended and where something entirely new had begun. That the morning mist clung to the valleys like a silver veil, and yet Alina found herself waking earlier each day, her steps carrying her outside to watch the sun lift over the jagged peaks, the quiet of the lodge wrapping around her like a sanctuary. Adrian had been more reserved since that evening on the porch, though not distant, his words still echoing in her mind as she moved through the days, the moments between them charged with something she could neither name nor dismiss. One afternoon, while she was helping the lodge owner carry firewood, she saw Adrian standing by the tree line, speaking into his phone, his voice low and controlled, but the tension in his posture clear. When their eyes met across the clearing, something in her stomach tightened. She knew without asking that it had to do with Victor. She didn't press him yet. The unease lingered like a shadow over the rest of the day. That night, as they sat before the fire in the lodge's main room, she finally asked if Victor had found them. He hesitated for a moment, then admitted that one of his men had been spotted in a nearby town, and that it was only a matter of time before they traced their path. Her chest clenched at the thought, but before she could speak, he told her firmly that he would not allow them to take her back. She stared into the fire, the flickering light throwing sharp angles across his face, and felt a surge of something fierce and unshakable. For this man who had no reason to stand between her and the life she had run from, and yet did without hesitation. The following afternoon, the inevitable arrived, the sound of engines echoing up the narrow mountain. Rode a black SUV emerging from the trees, its tires crunching over gravel. The air seemed to thicken around her as the vehicle rolled to a stop and the back door opened. Victor stepped out in an immaculate suit, his presence filling the space like an unwelcome storm. His gaze swept the clearing and landed on her, a slow smile curling across his face as though he had already won. She felt the instinct to shrink back, but Adrian moved forward, placing himself between them, his stance relaxed but unyielding. Victor's voice was smooth, almost amused, as he told Adrian that this was a private matter and that he should step aside, but Adrian did not move. Instead, he said calmly that Alina was not going anywhere. She did not want to go. The smile on Victor's face faltered, just enough for her to see the sharpness beneath it, and he stepped closer, addressing her directly, saying that she had embarrassed him and her family long enough, that it was time to end this childish rebellion. Alina's hands curled into fists. At her sides, every part of her wanting to spit back the truth of what he was, but before she could speak, Adrian's voice cut through the cold air, telling Victor that if he valued what little reputation he had left, he would leave quietly. Victor's gaze shifted between them, his eyes narrowing, as if trying to gauge what bound them together, and then in a tone laced with disdain, said, "So this is what you've chosen? A man who hides in the mountains, instead of facing the world? You think he can protect you from me?" Alina stepped forward, her voice steady, though her heart was pounding, telling Victor that she did not need anyone to protect her from him, because she was no longer afraid of him, or the life he represented. The words felt like a door slamming shut behind her, one she would never open again. Victor's jaw tightened, the mask of charm slipping to reveal the fury beneath. But Adrian's calm, unflinching presence held the moment in balance. The two men locked in a silent standoff until finally Victor turned his attention back to the SUV, signaling his men to get inside. He left without another word, the sound of the engine fading into the distance, leaving only the thrum of Alina's pulse in her ears. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, and when she looked at Adrian, his gaze was still fixed on the road, as if waiting for the SUV to vanish entirely. When he finally turned to her, there was something unguarded in his eyes that made her chest tighten. He asked if she was sure about what she had said, that she was not afraid anymore, and she told him she had never been more certain of anything in her life. They returned to the lodge in silence, but it was a silence heavy with all the things that had been left unsaid that evening. After dinner, she stepped out onto the porch alone, the sky awash with stars, the mountains standing like dark sentinels against the horizon. She thought of the girl she had been only weeks ago, the one trapped in a gilded cage, too afraid to reach for the key, and she realized she had not just escaped, she had transformed. She heard the door open behind her and felt rather than saw Adrian join her, his presence steady and grounding. They stood without speaking for a long moment, until he finally said that when he had seen her on that rain-soaked night tearing down the road in a wedding gown, he had not been able to look away, not because she was reckless, but because she was free in a way he had almost forgotten was possible. She turned to him, the cool night air carrying the faint scent of pine and wood smoke between them, and told him that meeting him had been the first time in her life she had felt seen, not as a daughter, not as a bride, not as a pawn, but as herself. His gaze held hers, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow to the space between them. Then he stepped closer, his hand lifting to cup her cheek, the warmth of his touch sending a shiver down her spine. She leaned into it, her pulse quickening, and in the quiet of the mountains, under the watch of the stars, he kissed her. It was not hurried or desperate, but steady and certain, a promise rather than a question. When they finally parted, he rested his forehead against hers, telling her that whatever came next, they would face it together. She smiled faintly, knowing that for the first time in her life the future was hers to choose. The days that followed were different, though. The routines of the lodge remained the same. There was an unspoken shift between them in the way his hand would brush hers as they passed in the hallway, in the way their eyes would meet across the room, carrying silent conversations. In the mornings they rode the motorcycle down winding roads simply to feel the wind on their faces. In the evenings they lingered by the fire, trading pieces of their pasts, as if weaving them into something shared. Alina found herself laughing more freely, speaking without fear, and even making plans for what she might do when the snow began to fall and the mountains closed their roads to the world. Adrian listened to each idea without judgment, sometimes offering advice, sometimes only watching her with a look that made her feel as if she could do anything. One night, as they sat outside wrapped in blankets, watching the slow dance of the northern lights across the sky, she realized that freedom and love were not separate choices, but threads of the same fabric, each strengthening the other. And as Adrian's arm drew her closer, she knew that no matter where the road took them, she would never again be the girl who had once ridden through the rain to escape her own wedding. She had become the woman who could ride toward anything without fear, and who had found someone willing to ride beside her every step of the way.